So we're going to begin. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for being resilient. I'm going to share my screen. Heidi's going to begin us.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from whatever time zone you find yourself in. I'm Heidi Weston. I'm an undergraduate at Elon University, and today, along with Peter and Allison, we're going to be talking about mattering in higher education. So Peter's going to start off by giving us kind of our literature grounding.
Great. Thanks, Heidi. Yeah, this is work that Heidi has been leading us on. We're hoping to write a sort of conceptual paper with a bit of data drawn from two sources. We'll talk about that. And this is our first attempt to try out these ideas with an audience. So we're really eager for your questions and comments. Where this paper comes from, where this work comes from, originally is research on students' sense of belonging and how important belonging is, or a sense of belonging is, for undergraduates. And there is research from all over the world. Belonging is one of the most highly cited constructs lately, because belonging is correlated with a lot of very positive things for undergraduates. You can see some on the screen about successful transition in, persistence in graduation from, academic performance, and well-being, right? So a sense of belonging seems to really matter a lot for students. One of the interesting things about this very, very influential construct is that it's really poorly defined. There's lots of different definitions of belonging out there, and they don't all share the same things. And actually, even if you go to some of the core sources, the definitions are broad and messy. And all our slides are already posted in Canopy, so if you want to just get them, you can have them there. But so a helpful definition, and a very common we use definition, is this one from Escher and Weeks, which says really there's two parts to belonging: a sense of valued involvement, the feeling that you're valued, needed, accepted in an environment, and then a sense of fit, that your characteristics, who you are, is shared and complementary with others in that environment, right? So those are sort of the two core parts of belonging. And recently, scholars, some of them being us, but mostly being others, have begun to critique belonging. And it's interesting, this critique is coming from a number of different places around the world, but it's centering on the same sort of thing. So there's a new study, came out late last year, from the US, a large study done by scholars at the University of Southern California of living learning communities at another university, that notices this, that belonging doesn't seem to be a good construct to describe the students of color in the United States. Students of color, even ones who are successful academically, report a much lower sense of belonging. So its predictive power isn't as useful when you look at students of color compared to white students. In the US, Karen Gravitt and a colleague who from Australia, whose first name I can't remember, have a brand new paper out that calls for rethinking belonging as a construct, because they identify that there's students who may not wish to or cannot belong, right? And again, speaking from the US context, this concept of belonging is actually fairly problematic in a world where we're also talking about Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of reconsiderations of the legacies of slavery in this country. Saying students belong at or to an institution is highly problematic. And there's one more critique of belonging, which is coming from a different direction that's really helpful and we want to poke into also. This is from a brand new book by a sociologist in the US, an ethnographic study of one institution. And one of the points Lisa Nunn makes in this book, in the introduction, is belonging is something that communities give individuals. It's not something individuals can do themselves. And that, we think, is problematic for a number of reasons, which we'll explain. But so broad context here, belonging matters a lot, but it's quite problematic. And so a number of scholars have started to talk about mattering as another way of looking at this. Here are three different definitions of mattering, and these three make a point taken together. The first one is from social psychologists studying adolescence and studying adolescent behavior, especially sort of traditional college-age adolescent behavior, risk-taking behavior, suicidal ideation, and things like this. And what those sociologists, social psychologists have found is that mattering is immensely important in students' well-being. Students who have a sense of mattering are much less likely to do risky or self-harming behaviors, right? The second paper that we're citing here is a paper by social psychologists and clinical psychologists who are looking at mattering and undergraduate student well-being. And they find, so they're not looking at learning, they're not looking at classrooms, they're just looking at overall student well-being in American higher education. And they also find mattering is really, really important. There's a definition there. And then the third is an interesting old paper from the US in Student Affairs that says, that actually argues against belonging back in 1989 and says mattering is the way to study what Schlossberg calls marginalized student groups. And she defines mattering in this way. So notice what mattering really is from that belonging definition is it's the valued involvement. It's not the fit. And we'll unpack that a little bit more as we go. So a tiny bit about our context and data before Heidi shares some data and Allison provides some analysis. So we're drawing on two sets of interviews, one done for a book that I co-authored with Leo Lambert, and one from a rich set of interviews Allison has collected over the years with student consultants at Bryn Mawr and Haverford College. And so for this paper, for this presentation, we're looking at these student partners from Bryn Mawr and Haverford who are students, undergraduates, almost all what we in the US would call new majority students, so students of color, low-income students, sometimes international students, who are partnering with a faculty member in pedagogical partnership program. That's one set of the data. The other set of data is from a series of student peer mentoring programs at LaGuardia Community College in New York City. LaGuardia has 50,000 students. Almost all of them are low income, almost all of them are first generation college students. And they have really powerful and really well-known peer mentoring programs. So those are where the interviews come from. I'm going to turn it over to Heidi to talk about what's in the interviews.
So as we went through the interviews conducted at Bryn Mawr, Haverford, and LaGuardia, we started to notice something really interesting. Students described feeling that they mattered rather than they belonged. In some cases, they mattered despite the lack of belonging. This is the instance for one SALT student partner who said, "I never felt like I was a student first. I was always Black on this campus and then a student. When I would step into the SALT meetings or when I would be with my faculty partner, it was like the first time I felt heard all week." This student describes a situation in which their racial identity prevented them from feeling that they belonged within their campus as a student. However, despite this, the student was still able to feel seen and heard through their work as a student partner. This is able to happen because mattering is not focused on fit. Mattering, unlike belonging, is focused on accepting differences, where belonging is inherently focused on sameness. This focus on difference created the environment.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. Created the environment in which the peer mentoring program for Latinx students in LaGuardia has flourished. One student participant described how the program was not focused on finding people who were just acceptable. It was about integrating people who by normal societal standards are not necessarily acceptable and introducing them to everyone else and having them be open to that person. This program's focus not on a simulation, but on building diverse connections between people that were meaningful led to mattering among students. So students described that they matter, but how do they feel this feeling was fostered? We identified 3 sources throughout our interviews. The first of which comes when students feel they are taken seriously. A Haverford student partner described how their input and ideas are taken seriously by their faculty member. A Bryn Mawr student partner, in almost the exact same words, said, "My advice was taken seriously." While these are quotes describing the student and faculty relationships, peer relationships created a similar environment. Referring to the conversations within weekly meetings of student partners in SALT, one student stated, "I feel like my opinions actually matter." Working as a student partner allows students to recognize that they have something to contribute and that this contribution matters. The situations through these quotes are more than validation for a job well done. They are evidence of students' insights mattering to those in which they collaborate. Our second source of mattering we identified comes when students feel they have voice. A former SALT student partner stated how being a partner literally gave me voice. The development of voice in students is crucial because it empowers students to stand up for their needs. Another former SALT student partner described a situation in which they felt extremely uncomfortable with the way a professor was covering curriculum. This student stated that the reason they chose to address the issue with their faculty member was that because they have a right to feel comfortable and engaged in class. This student not only felt that they had a voice in which to contribute, but also that it was important and needed to be taken seriously by a figure of authority. To feel that you have voice exemplifies an understanding that you and your experiences matter and need to be taken into account by those with whom you interact. The third source of mattering we found comes when someone feels that they are invested in. This source of mattering was more prominent among the students interviewed at LaGuardia. This is due to the different structures and goals of the peer mentoring programs compared to SALT. This led to different experiences with mattering among students. One student in the peer mentoring program described how their mentors gave them the resources I needed to be part of a community, motivated me to graduate in ways I did not get from anybody else. Another student said that her peer mentors believed in me more than I did myself. Peer mentoring relationships make the mentee feel as if someone is invested in them because they are receiving validation that they are worthy of time and energy of others, that their dreams are valuable and significant, and that they as individuals matter. The lack of fit necessary for mattering allows students to carry the sense of mattering outside of the context in which it is fostered. One LaGuardia student said, "Every time I go in front of students and I second guess myself, I remember my student success mentor told me I am awesome." Next, Allison will be talking about how feeling that they mattered changes students' behaviors.
Yeah, so building on all of the literature that Peter shared and on some of the data that Heidi shared, we want to talk about what mattering enables, that maybe belonging does not enable. And we want to talk specifically about a concept that was new to me until fairly recently, agentic engagement, and link it back with one of the quotes we started with, and I'll explain what agentic engagement is in a minute. But this idea that the existing wisdom about sense of belonging on college campuses tends to neglect this important dynamic that belonging is something that communities provide for individuals. It is not something that individuals can garner for themselves. That is closely connected with this idea of agentic engagement. Agentic engagement is a fourth new form of engagement that a number of scholars have written about recently. And it's traditionally, engagement is conceptualized as having three dimensions or pathways that contribute to students' academic progress: behavioral, emotional, and cognitive. And the fourth form takes this into a new realm, right? These others are typically teacher initiated, and they're focused on supporting students, again, in kind of fitting, right, and engaging with what is offered. Whereas agentic engagement is a more proactive and student initiated version of engagement, and it can foster student empowerment and equity. And some of the research that I've done with colleagues at Florida Gulf Coast University, both within and beyond the classroom and across disciplinary contexts. So the idea is this kind of agency within and of engagement, right? As opposed to relying on others to make you feel you belong and can do, it is taking the initiative yourself, right, of being able to engage, of learning, of exploring, of all kinds of things. So that's the concept of agentic engagement that we see linked very closely with mattering. And so on the next slide, we have a few manifestations, really, of what mattering can enable. The first is advocating for the self. Right. Again, this is not waiting for other people to do or to take care of you. Right. So a SALT student partner talked about their right to feel comfortable and engaged in class. And if the professor is not making that happen, the student asserts, we can talk about that. We can figure it out. Right. So it isn't just sitting there, and many student partners talk about this. They used to think of themselves as students who just had to receive and be sort of guided by faculty. But once they develop the sense of agentic engagement and that they matter, then they can take that initiative and approach faculty and have those conversations. Another is advocating for others, right? So the complement of advocating for the self is advocating for others. And in LaGuardia's mentoring program, we saw one student technology mentor learned of a learning difference that one of the mentees had, which prompted that student mentor to advocate for that student's learning needs. Right? So again, it isn't sitting back, it isn't waiting for systems or people in higher positions of authority to do something, it's taking action. And SALT student partners talk about this as well, about becoming advocates for other students and, very interestingly, for faculty, right? For faculty, because they understand what teaching and learning really is about when they're in this kind of partnership. And so they advocate for students' learning needs and also for faculty in their efforts. And then finally, we have been talking a lot about this idea of durability or transferability of mattering, that it isn't context specific, it's within you, and therefore you can take it with you, right, from one context into another context. So one participant in the student success mentoring program at LaGuardia talked about how every time I go in front of students and I second guess myself, as Heidi had already said, I remember my student success mentor told me I am awesome, right? So the sort of carrying of that sense of mattering and of being a valuable person goes across context. And students in the SALT program talk about this as well, when they feel like they bring their sense of agentic engagement into their own courses, into their workplaces, into all the other areas of their lives. And so they carry that with them. So those are our three, what does mattering enable? And there's how you can follow up with us and ask us questions after we're done. But now we're moving into the question time, right? Peter and Heidi, is that our goal here?
Yeah, so the slides are available. And so we really would now like, if people are willing to either put questions in the chat or even better, turn your camera on or raise your hand or whatever, and engage with us, challenge us, invite us to think about new things or whatever. So anyone want to go first? There's a hand. Katarina Mortensen has her hand raised, so she goes first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Try again, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, a little.
A little, yeah.
I'll try, or otherwise I'll write in the chat. Okay, good. So I think this is amazing. It's sort of really not provoking, but it's heartening in so many ways. And I'm thinking, I think a difference between Sweden and the US is that in the US generally you have quite a bit of existing or growing programs, such as the ones you're describing here, mentoring programs, students as partnership programs, etc. We don't have much of that in Sweden. We have the regular courses, which are modules within an educational program. There's not much outside of that beyond what students arrange for themselves, like social activities and student engagement activities. So I'm wondering, what can regular, ordinary academic teachers do in their courses and modules in order to make the students feel that they matter? Do we need all these particular specific programs to help the students feel that they matter? I would like to hear your opinions on that.
Well, I'll start and then my colleagues will clean up. I think going back to the analysis Heidi shared, I think we can do this just in our courses without programs. And the three things that foster mattering, someone takes me seriously, I have a voice, someone is invested in me. I think there's ways that the way we teach, the way we give feedback, the way we interact with students can reinforce some of those things. And of course, it's different in different contexts and bigger classes and everything, but I think those are possible. Heidi, Allison, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I was going to follow along the same lines. I mean, if you're looking for a specific tool to use, feedback. A lot of the reasons that SALT student partners felt that their were taken seriously and they had voice is because part of their partnership is giving a professor, which is their partner, feedback on how they're teaching what they're teaching. Any student can sit in a classroom and say, oh, I liked when this happened. I didn't like when this happened. So giving students a space for feedback could be a very useful tool.
Yeah, and just to build on what Heidi's saying, that is a form of creating a structure for student voice, right, is that kind of feedback. I mean, and thinking about what structures can we create to invite student voices to be in dialogue with one another and to be in dialogue with us, I think will go quite quickly to a sense of mattering.
And one of the things to be attentive to, and I don't know the context in Sweden very well, Katarina, but some students tend to come in the US, some students come to campus feeling like they matter, feeling like they have voice and are being taken seriously. And so one of the things I think we need to be really attentive to is which students need support, challenge, attention to enable them to feel like they have a voice, that someone is invested in them, and really explicitly reaching to those students and engaging with those students. Allison, there's a question from Megan Wilson in the chat. I'll just read it. With these notions of belonging, I'm curious how this might play out on an unofficial social level. Do you, for example, see SALT participants engaging socially on their own accord, or does this play into notions of mattering?
So Megan, do you mean socially engaging with one another and feeling like they matter? I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question. Maybe you can clarify that.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at. So just to wrap my head around this is, like, do SALT participants know one another? Like, do they all communicate as student groups? And do they, because they all know each other, then become friends with one another? And does that play into our idea of belonging versus mattering at all, do you think?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question, actually. I just was going over students' mid-semester feedback. They do meet weekly with one another and with me. So there are spaces where they have this kind of conversation and they develop this sense of mattering. And one of them, one piece of the feedback that's just jumping into my mind was like, I made such good friends, in this program. So in that sense, yes, they do connect. But I think more important than the friendship is the sense that they are taken seriously and that their ideas really matter. They talk, I get fewer comments about making friends than I get about making connections, about feeling like they're valued, like they, like they matter. We're struggling with trying to find other words to name this, but that is absolutely happens. And they support one another in navigating these institutions, in ways that otherwise they feel really like they don't matter to the institutions.
Wonderful,
Heidi,
thank you for that.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Heidi?
No, I would say Allison covered it very nicely.
Okay, so I want to add just one small thing, which is that the research on belonging says that belonging is very context specific. So a student might be in a club or an organization or a program like SALT and feel like they belong with their SALT peers, but they don't feel like they belong elsewhere on campus. One of the things we're finding that we think is interesting about mattering is once the students seem to develop the sense that they matter through a program like SALT, that mattering goes with them outside of that friend group. Nathan.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you all. Can you hear me? Great. So thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's really fabulous, and I really appreciate the subtle but really meaningful shift from belonging over to mattering. And I think, it has a lot of really wonderful implications. So my research actually deals with sense of belonging in school. I'm a psychometrician, so by training. So I'm curious to investigate to what extent do you have interest, or have you already started investigating the construct, the sociological construct of mattering? And to what extent is it stable? So Peter, you started to unpack that a little bit in terms of the context specific, but I'm invested in to what extent can we have a sense or understanding of what mattering means in a larger context that's transferable across different dimensions.
Great question, Nathan. I am a historian by training, so I'm going to answer your question with a lot of caution. Because the people writing about mattering, especially the people writing about mattering related to adolescent well-being, adolescent risk-taking behavior and things like this, are psychologists and sociologists. My understanding is their research suggests that mattering is quite durable and stable, as we're talking about. So if you have someone in a school setting, for example, who helps an alienated adolescent feel like they matter, that student is less likely to try to harm themselves or do risk-taking behavior in any aspect of their life, not only in a school context. But I would love wise colleagues helping us think even further about that. Thanks for the question. Susanna, McGowan, you had a comment that, do you want to voice that?
Hi, I'll just say hi. I just really appreciated Heidi's comment on the role of feedback and mattering and this idea of voice and investment of time. And that's certainly something that I bring to how I try to give feedback to people. And it made me think of the concept of giver's gain in the writing feedback process. And I love that concept because of what the student is, or anyone is learning in the feedback process along the way, and how that learning accumulates in lots of different ways. So it's just it was more of an observation and a connection to Heidi's comments, and made me think of that concept of giver's gain as something that might transfer to the mattering space. And thank you for the presentation.
Okay, Marion, last question or comment.
Yes, okay. And a number of things I wanted to ask. One was, firstly, I was fascinated with, I kind of presumed that a sense of belonging would include a notion of mattering. I might have called it something different. So that was fascinating. But let's say, can one though be conducive to developing the other? Let's say if I belong in the tennis club and the group, and I belong in a class, I know it's context specific. Will that help, let's say, shouldn't that help my construct of myself? And I suppose I'm interested as well to think about, when you feel valued, as it were, the mattering comes into play, but how much of that as well can we talk about in terms of confidence and self-belief and resilience? And I no doubt some of this is like a topography and has to be investigated yet, but it's a fascinating field. I'd agree with Katrina earlier. It is brilliant. Like it's a new way of thinking and of working. So thank you so much. But I'm I suppose interested in those angles, and in I suppose as well, if you think of kind of a social constructivist model, and both in our pedagogy, but also where, that the person is constructed as well in terms of the society and in relation to it, and in relation to the dominant culture, I suppose. So, and again, even though you say it's durable, and depending on our context, can we be made vulnerable again? And even though the mapping is transferable, can we, how vulnerable is the person still, I suppose? And thanks. There's a lot in there now, sorry.
I can take part of your question. So Peter, Alice, and I have spent a lot of time trying to disentangle mattering from belonging. They're very closely tied. But one of the ways I felt that was very helpful in separating the two is I can belong to an organization, let's say Women in History. I'm a history major, I'm a woman, I belong to that identity, but I can still sit in on a meeting and feel like people aren't taking me seriously and that I don't matter to the people around me. So mattering can exist without belonging.
Yes.
That was my one piece that I wanted to contribute.
No, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, just first, we're over time, so thank you everybody for being here, and we know people have to run. we can hang for a couple more minutes, I think, just to keep chatting. Two things I want to tease out, and Marion, it relates to your question, and Nicole Redmond has a comment in the chat about can belonging and mattering be a both and, or are they mutually exclusive? And as Heidi said, we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think I at least started on the, down with belonging, yay mattering, and I am not there as much anymore. I think they're complementary, but there's at least one way that I think belonging is deeply flawed. And that is, well, one advantage of belonging, as Nicole Redmond says in her chat, is it puts the onus on the institution to really work and not just putting the pressure on students to act. But the way that it's deeply flawed is that some people are not going to feel, because of identities, are going to be very much less likely to feel like they belong. Some people may not want to feel like they belong in an institution. If I'm a Black American with enslaved ancestors and I'm attending an institution that was founded by slaveholders and built on slavery, the idea that I might want to belong at that institution might be quite problematic for me, right? And so that is not to say belonging as a construct is bad. It's that belonging as a construct, as both Allison and Heidi have said, is exclusionary in some ways.
Yeah.
And that seems problematic. And so I think we're suggesting not belonging bad, but that mattering might have most of the utility or almost all of the utility of belonging and be more open to difference.
Yes.
Yeah, and Marion, I mean, what I've heard from students and what our research has made me think more about is this your very question of like, how quickly can either of these be shaken? And I think belonging can be shaken more quickly than mattering. I mean, both can be shaken, certainly. There's no claims here of permanent anything. But I think when you have a strong sense of mattering that's more within than between, which is where belonging is, then I think it's less likely to be destabilized than when you step out of a context in which you belong and suddenly you don't feel as strong or confident or clear anymore. But again, with Peter, I mean, I'm not saying forget belonging at all. I mean, I really appreciate, Nicole, the both and.
Well, thank you. It's very, very interesting.
Thank you, everybody. I believe the next sessions start in 4 minutes, so we should probably be kind to our colleagues and say thanks for being here. Please follow up if you have questions or comments, and we hope to be presenting more and publishing more on this in the near future.